I feel like I don't want to stop now. It's 2 a.m. and I feel like I've got so much more to say on corporate governance, but unfortunately, we're kind of almost at the end of my slides, so I guess I can't say any more without more slides. But this is one of my favorite units. It's on international corporate governance. So let's get into it. Unit 7 answers the question as to why companies list abroad in the first place. Some of the crisis-driven reforms in emerging markets, some of the reforms that have happened in the more developed countries, and that case that I promised you about a merger between a bank-orientated economy and a market-orientated economy. So, private sector is looking good. Excluding China, most democracies, even social democracies, have started to stay out of business. The private sector has become, one of the biggest generators of jobs, innovation, economic growth. So these are good things. And just like there's demand and supply for products, there's demand and supply for capital. And that demand and supply is global. Just like a country can benefit from buying a good from another country, countries also benefit from being able to trade in capital with other countries. Remember how I said the roads in America were built using capital from Europe, where insufficient capital was available in America at the time. In a closed economy, a firm's capital requirements are dependent on the domestic level of savings only. But where domestic capital from domestic savings isn't sufficient, there are options for raising external capital from international investors. Just like we studied, international investors want certain things. Number one, a legal system that protects them. Number two, audited accounts. Number three, reporting. Number four, future growth opportunities. Number five, ability to sell their shares to the highest bidder and fair voting rights. The Cadbury Code. Look at this chocolate. This is the best, juiciest picture of chocolate that I could find. So international capital markets have increasingly responded to the demands of the international investors for better protection. And self-regulation in capital markets is where market participants themselves voluntarily agree to bond or to commit themselves to higher standards of business practice. And self-regulation is a signal to investors that even in the absence of the country making laws, the market will put its reputation for better governance practice on the line. And the London Stock Exchange and the Bank of England did something like this when they instituted the first corporate governance code, which is the Cadbury Code in 1992. And it was called the Cadbury Code because the executing committee was chaired by Sir Adrian Cadbury, which of course, he used to run the chocolate business. So that was why it was called the Cadbury Code. And it contained a list of sort of non-binding best practice governance rules that companies require. And companies actually were not compulsory required to follow it, but they're required to disclose how well they adhere to that list. Why do companies list abroad? This is a picture of Wale Tinubu, who famously listed his company Owando, both on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Several reasons: cross listing, securing cheap equity capital, allowing owners to divest controlling stakes on more liquid markets, preparation for foreign acquisitions, improving the firm's corporate governance by committing itself to a higher standard of disclosure, strengthening the firm's international reputation. And there are over 100 African companies, over 100 African companies in total are listed on the London Stock Exchange, all for similar reasons to the ones that I've just listed. Bonding. So an argument known as the legal bonding hypothesis is prominent in the literature. And this hypothesis explains how US exchanges attract firms because a US cross-listing signals a credible commitment to more disclosure by making a firm subject to, US law enforcement. Alternatively, a US cross-listing may facilitate informal reputation building, and this is an argument known as the reputational bonding hypothesis. The mechanisms behind both legal bonding and reputational bonding are, theoretically plausible, and they could act together simultaneously. So it's very difficult scientifically to disentangle both of their effects. Obviously, it's not the kind of bonding in the picture. Benefits of cross-listing, according to Ferris, are 4 in total: liquidity, marketing, exposure, and technical reasons. So liquidity is, the fact that, even in venture capital firms, for instance, like Cadbury Code, they need more capital at a lower cost than they can get in their countries. Exposure, there's prestige and image benefits to US or foreign exchange listing. There's also technical things like being able to list on, being able to make it easier to do a merger and acquisition if the target is foreign. However, some people say that it doesn't really work because the SEC actually finds it harder to go, in America, finds it actually harder to go after companies that are foreign anyway, and they hardly do. But even taking that into consideration, you have the hard bonding of a new set of laws and regulations and disclosures that you have to follow, otherwise it will delist you. And then you have the soft kind of bonding as well, where, there's all these intermediaries, financial analysts, underwriters, institutional investors that actually provide scrutiny beyond the rules. So I can remember when Jumia first listed, there was an activist sort of, I think they were a hedge fund or an investment firm, that wrote a very negative note about them. So if you're doing things that are against the rules, you have like the soft type of bonding issues to worry about as well, where America actually and the UK have a very active media. And even if it's not entirely, even if it's still within the rules, but it's just a bit dodgy, the analyst will write about you. So these are a few corporate governance case studies from around the world. This picture is actually from Italy. So before I go into the case studies, I just put this sort of reflection on corporate governance in Africa. And it says good corporate governance can make a difference by broadening ownership and reducing concentration of power within societies. It bolsters capital markets and stimulates innovation. It fosters long-term foreign direct investment, reduces volatility, and deters capital flight. We really need that in Africa. So, like we discussed in the first unit, before the Asian financial crisis, the corporations were highly indebted. The accounts were not a recognizable picture of the company's financial status. The regulators and courts didn't really know how to make judgments for investors and didn't really have the power. Controlling shareholders and top managers were more or less unaccountable, and there was a lot of corruption. And they had to make reforms to that, obviously, after the crisis. The same with South Korea. Even though South Korea was, quite straightforward and has a good reputation, they had to reform the chaebols. So the chaebols are the biggest companies in South Korea. And prior to the financial crisis, South Korea's chaebols just built up a huge amount of debt, 400 to 500 in terms of debt to equity ratios. So, the government had to institute the ACGA principles of debt restructuring, debt reduction, mutual payment guarantees had to stop. They had to improve transparency and strengthen the right of minority shareholders. Singapore is actually the country regarded with very, very high standards of corporate governance in comparison to their Asian counterparts. And I just wanted to point out, like the picture behind is a picture of the waterfall in the airport. It's amazing. So if you're ever in Singapore, please take a good look around the airport. But, there's been accusations that the state-run investment company, Temasek, has been criticized for influencing acquisition strategies at some of its subsidiaries. And this is a really interesting case from Singapore. This is a really famous hotel, and that whole top floor is actually a swimming pool. So if you're ever in Singapore, that's another nice place to visit. But back to the Iseton case. Iseton is actually a Japanese company registered in listed on the Singapore Exchange, and it was typified by large concentrated shareholders, and their independent directors were brothers who had previous dealings with Isetan back in Japan. So what happened was that they received a tax credit and didn't explain to shareholders what they wanted to do with it. Further issues included, like, they had a large amount of money in fixed deposit that they weren't telling shareholders anything about, and they weren't really declaring the earnings of a company called Orchard, which was a real estate company. And they weren't paying good dividends either. So 43 shareholders, owning almost 10%, organized to write a letter to the management and the chairman demanding an EGM. The chairman initially was like, oh, a fighting stance would not help your case, almost like snubbing the minority investors. And at the meeting, they stood their ground, right? And were like, look, if you don't regard us or we're not relevant, then buy us out. If you don't think that we're good enough to, deserve an explanation. Eventually, the company and the chairman had to bow to that pressure and pay out an interim dividend. And it resulted in a win-win because the increased transparency actually made the share price rise. It stimulated a lot of similar conversations across other companies who also had to level up their governance practices. The Daimler Chrysler case. So this was a case study that I promised you that shows sort of the clash between market-based systems and more bank-based systems. So the merger actually occurred in 1999 of a US car manufacturer Chrysler and the German car manufacturer Daimler-Benz. And there was very, very strong business logic underpinning the merger. It made total business sense. But what was less clear was the logic in, so I'm going to have some water, the logic in merging two companies with the different cultures. And obviously the cultural clash was most evident on the board. So the merger was actually incorporated under German law, which stipulated a two-tier board system with half of the supervisory board being taken up by employees. So they had a stakeholder view, whereas Chrysler was almost exclusively dedicated to shareholder value. So there was no stakeholder except the shareholder, and the shareholder, the sole aim was profit. The Daimler's largest shareholders were German banks, and they occupied 3 board seats. But Chrysler's board was dominated by outsiders, these independent directors. And the management style of both companies was so different. Like, the Chrysler was chaired by Kirk Kerkhogan, who made his fortune in Las Vegas gambling. And obviously he was focused on share price, he wanted buybacks, he wanted dividends, he wanted to take over bids. While Daimler was chaired by, Hima Cooper, chairman of a very conservative Deutsche Bank. So you can see the problem. Disclosure was another fractious issue. Of course, the German investors were banks. They're not transparent in their reporting. And the company's first annual report really caused problems in America because they just didn't think it had enough information. It had no details on executive pay, director stock ownership, or information on the largest shareholders. And the worst thing about it is American shareholders take their right to vote, even to the last minute, electronically, very seriously. But the Germans said, look, the deadline for receiving votes is 4 days before the meeting. Not only is it 4 days, but we can only receive your votes by mail. So obviously the American investors felt like they were disenfranchised, because that's a very important part of American culture, the ability to vote electronically from wherever you are. the pay was the funniest part of it altogether because Germany is this social democrat that I always like kind of spoke about, or I continually spoke about in the earlier units. Consensual, egalitarian corporate culture, very modest executive pay. In the year before the merger, the 10 members of Daimler Benz's management board earned $11 million. The guy, I can't pronounce German names, Skurem, took 1.5 to 2 million. But the Chrysler managers took home 3 times. The 5 Chrysler managers ended up taking home 3 times what the Daimler counterparts made. So obviously there was a clash of interests. The CEO of the German was taking home $2 million. The CEO of the American side was taking home $13 million. It was just very difficult. The efficiency, when the Germans got to the factory in America and they saw that the cars were taking 40 hours to make, compared to 20 hours for Toyota and Honda, of course, the German machine, German efficiency, German engineering, it doesn't fit with that kind of inefficiency. So they were upset with the inefficiencies or upset with the high fixed costs. It ended kind of in heartbreak, actually. The breakup of Daimler Chrysler was announced in 2007 in May with the sale to a private equity firm. And they said that it was because of market-related things, rising oil prices and co. But we know, I think it was probably due to the differences in culture as well. So in conclusion, we looked at the reasons why companies seek international finance, we looked at cross-listing issues and case studies from Asia, and we looked at the case of a failed, in quotes, merger between an American company and a European company. The final unit. So this is a very short unit where we'll just be looking at a few corporate governance codes. The most prominent are the OECD code and the ICGN code. The principle of shareholder value remains a central focus in almost all codes, but some of them have their drawbacks. So I think it's important to look into both the OECD and the ICGN codes, which are pretty straightforward. So this is a bonus bit about my work on boards. So I've sat on several boards, healthcare companies and other types of companies, as well as obviously the boards of companies that I've started. And I think a key question that I get is, should you have a board? I think my answer is always, having an external voice, whether it's an advisory board or a board of directors consisting of your investors, just brings more people into your camp. So I think, if your company is a going concern and you feel like that external input could be useful, I think it's worth getting together a board. The second question I get is investors that ask you for board seats. Obviously, you have only a few board seats to give out, and they should be given out to the investors that you feel would add the most value, which might not necessarily be the investors that gave you the most money. So it's a difficult conversation to have, basically, but I think always look for value. Advisory boards versus governance boards. Obviously, advisory are more informal around advice and usually aren't investors, whereas governance boards are usually directors. If you're getting ready to chair a board, then you're in charge of the agenda, you're in charge of voting, you're in charge of retiring directors according to the KAMA law here in Nigeria. So just getting up to speed with the processes and protocols, what needs to be voted on, how many people need to move for each motion, and even the moving for adjournment is important. Working on board committees is hard work. And usually as a board member, you'll be a member of several committees as well. I think, it's useful to have some kind of financial expertise. If you're on an audit committee, for instance, I think it's useful to brush up on your basic, even if you're joining a board in the first place, I think finance is a key thing. But if you're on the audit committee, I think it's even more important. How to prepare for your board meetings. Read the board papers, read the minutes of the last meeting, and make sure that you have your notes handy. Dealing with board politics, I think it's really important to make sure that you understand how to hold crucial conversations and how you can articulate a point truthfully and frankly, without causing offense. But I think, overall, your duty is to the shareholder and you need to work in the shareholder interest. This brings me to the end of this 8-part series. I hope it's been enjoyable. Thank you very much.